Welcome to the RLH Project's podcast, Love Matters, where we talk about real academic research mixed with real-life experiences to hopefully improve the real relationships you have with important people in your life. I'm the founder of the RLH Project and the host of the Love Matters podcast, Dr. Jenny Rosier. I'm also an associate professor of communication studies at James Madison University, a wife to my favorite person on the planet, a mother of 4 young children, and an all-around love enthusiast. As an expert in romantic and parent-child relationships, I've dedicated my life to figuring out how individuals can use communication to live happy, healthy lives connected to other people. I hope that this podcast can help you. Hello, friends! This is the first season of the RLH Project's podcast, Love Matters. For season 1, I've decided to do an in-depth 12-episode explanation of a single concept that impacts us all, attachment. I actually teach a class at James Madison University in the School of Communication Studies called Attachment Communication, and much of this season's podcast is based on my lectures from that class. And so that's the plan for season 1 of the Love Matters podcast, an in-depth 12-episode explanation of the science of attachment with relevant stories from myself and a ton of cool people I know sprinkled throughout. Lucky for you, I'm not just offering a podcast to help you understand attachment. I've also created a 60-page digital workbook that you can purchase through the link in my Instagram bio at Relationships Love Happiness, or on my website, www.relationshipslovehappiness.com. This digital workbook not only complements the podcast, but it also includes extra attachment tips and information not covered in the podcast, and includes self-reflection prompts throughout that will encourage you to dig deep and reflect on your own past and current life experiences. Before you start listening to this episode, get yourself a copy of the Attachment Matters digital workbook. You won't regret it. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. No matter what time it is, no matter where you are, I am so thankful that you are spending your time with me. Today, in episode 3, I'm going to talk about attachment in early childhood. If you're following along in the Attachment Matters digital workbook, we're on chapter 3. To help you fully understand attachment in early childhood, I want to start off by asking you to imagine yourself in a familiar scenario. One of these things probably has happened to you at some point. So think of a time where you had a really bad day. And this could be anything from you had a rough day at work or at school, like things just kept not going right, or you found out that someone you loved had passed away, you lost your job, you got in a serious argument with one of your best friends, and your friendship could potentially be over. Something really bad happened. And if you haven't experienced one of those days yet, you are lucky. Now I want you to imagine that you've come home to your significant other. And you're very, very upset. You're visibly upset. And you sit on the couch and you are just so upset about what happened to you. And it really doesn't matter what happened. You are just upset. And that is what really matters here. And your significant other pats you on the shoulder and says, "All right, I'm just going to let you cry in this room. I'll be back. You can get through this on your own." That sounds silly, doesn't it? I mean, who would be with someone who would do that to them? And if you've never been in a romantic relationship before, and so it's really just too hard for you to imagine what a romantic partner would say or do in that situation, as an adult, think about what you would do if you went home to your parents and you had had this bad day and your mom just tapped you on the shoulder and said, Oh, it's okay, honey. You'll get through this. I'll be back in 10 minutes. You go ahead and cry by yourself. I think you would not react very well to that situation. Unfortunately, this is what a lot of people do with their infants. If you don't have children yourself and you haven't been around many kids, you probably have never heard of the cry it out method. Cry it out was originally developed as a sleep training method to help children learn to self soothe, to help infants, tiny babies, self soothe and fall asleep on their own and not wake up in the middle of the night and need a parent. Interestingly, not only has research shown that the cry it out method is not very effective at sleep training, so it doesn't really do what it's supposed to do, but it also has this pesky side effect of damaging attachment bonds that a parent has with a child. Specifically, a baby, and by child I mean a baby, like a little tiny baby, wakes up in the middle of the night and cries, to which mom or dad doesn't respond. Baby, according to this method, will learn to self-soothe and will put itself back to sleep. And as a parent, you will not have to go and tend to your child in the middle of the night anymore. Here's what's actually happening. Baby cries in the middle of the night, desperately wanting a parent to help soothe them. Parents don't come. Baby starts to lose trust that the parent will come. Baby develops a mental framework that parents are not reliable, that there isn't someone who will help them downregulate their stress, so they might as well just stop crying. It is not that they have learned to self-soothe. Instead, what is happening is they are developing a mental framework that tells them that it is not worth it to cry because no one will help. And that is why the crying stops. Not because they've suddenly matured as a 6-month-old baby. Now, does this mean that if you have done the cry it out method with your baby, that your baby is doomed to a life of insecure attachment? No, it doesn't. But just like not everyone who smokes cigarettes gets lung cancer, not everyone who experiences the cry it out method has damaged attachment. And as I've said before, attachment is much more complicated than that. The reason that lots of children who experienced the cry it out method as infants might have some damaged attachment later in life is often because of the fact that a parent who is willing to let their child cry incessantly and not attend to them at night might also be willing to do it during the day. There's one reason. So if a child cries all night long and nobody helps, and then a child cries during the day and nobody helps, clearly attachment is going to be seriously damaged. Now, are there parents out there who have done the cry it out method with their child and then they are wonderfully supportive and secure and responsive and loving during the day and their child's attachment is not damaged? Sure, there are those people out there. I would argue, though, that even if the latter is your experience, you do cry it out method with your child at night, but during the day you're unbelievably responsive and sensitive and consistent, there is still going to be some damage to attachment. Now, is there going to be full-blown attachment disorders? Probably not. Could your child experience more anxiety than other children? Maybe. Could your child experience more avoidance than other children? Maybe. And so for me, I don't smoke cigarettes because I don't want to risk getting lung cancer. In the same way, I don't do the cry it out method because I don't want to risk my child's attachment being damaged. This idea that we should leave our children or our babies to cry to teach them independence, that's really what the cried out method is all about, is just one of the 5 myths surrounding attachment in early childhood that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. But before we get into that, I want to really give you a bit of a recap. I know it seems like we've already talked about what attachment in early childhood looks like in the previous 2 episodes. But I'd like to tell you again, especially if this is the first episode that you are tuning into. So let's review. When an infant is born, they are incapable of communicating with words. The only way that they can communicate is to cry or grunt or make some other kind of sound. When an infant cries, which they do all the time for reasons like feeling hungry or tired, feeling scared after hearing a loud noise, or simply just wanting to be held, a primary caregiver needs to consistently respond to the infant and figure out what the infant needs. When caregivers respond, attachment bonds are created. Depending on how they respond, attachment bonds can be very secure or all the way down, like on a secure insecure continuum, all the way down to insecure. Attachment security is not an either or categorical variable. It's not like you are secure or you're insecure. Most likely you have high attachment security, moderate attachment security, low attachment security to high attachment insecurity. It's a continuum, a secure, insecure continuum. So attachment is used to explain the bond between a child and their caregiver or caregivers. So caregivers can be just one person. Many times one parent will become an attachment figure for a child. Or it can be a few individuals, like maybe a parent and then a grandparent or a child care provider. So anyone who spends a significant amount of time with an infant has the potential to become an attachment figure for that infant. And so what this means is that any adult that spends a significant amount of time with a child, with a baby, should be able to physically and emotionally attend to all of that infant's needs. And then when a pattern of consistent, loving, sensitive responsiveness occurs between a primary caregiver and an infant, attachment bonds are developed. I hope that recap helped. Now let's talk about 5 main myths that I plan to debunk that are associated with attachment in early childhood. The first one is that holding a baby too much spoils the baby. This is just not true. In fact, babies who are held more frequently tend to explore the world around them more willingly as toddlers because they learn to trust that the world is a safe place to be. That is an attachment phenomenon. The more you hold a child when they're young, the more you nurture a baby's dependence on you for physical touch and emotional attention when they're babies, can actually empower them to explore later. It can actually cause toddlers and preschoolers to have more independence later on because they have developed this secure attachment with a primary caregiver that makes them feel like the world is a safe place to be and that other people are good. So they're much more willing to be independent. And so the myth is far from the truth. It's the opposite of what the myth says. Holding a baby now can actually empower them to be more independent later. The second myth is that babies need to learn discipline. I remember years ago, I had a friend post on Facebook something like, "How do you keep a 13-month-old in timeout?" Question mark, LOL. And I remember I couldn't help myself and I responded to the Facebook post. I said, "What would a 13-month-old do that would warrant a punishment or discipline?" It doesn't matter what the rest of our conversation was. The point that I was trying to make was that babies, which really are 0 to 18 months, don't need to learn discipline. They need to learn routine. They need to learn that someone is always there for them. They need to learn that adults are reliable. They need to learn that they are loved and lovable. But they don't need to learn discipline. That is a myth. The third myth that I'm going to debunk is something that we talked about in the beginning of this episode. It's that babies should cry it out to learn independence. And I think I've already given some explanation about why that doesn't work. Not only does crying it out not teach a child independence, but it can have a potentially damaging impact on a child's attachment later in life. And so I'm not going to do that explanation again, but what I thought I would talk about for a couple of minutes is a study that Tracy Castles, a evolutionary psychologist, and I published in 2020 in the Journal of Family Issues. And it is a historical analysis of how the cried out sleep training method became authoritative knowledge, like how it became an acceptable thing to do in Western culture. And so I will post a link to this article in the show notes on Anchor. But for right now, I'll just give you a couple highlights of how this cried out method came to be. So all the way back in the late 1800s, there was a doctor named Dr. Emmett Holt. And he is considered by many to be the father of pediatrics. And he is the first person to strongly suggest that parents could spoil their infants if they gave in to the baby's desire for frequent carrying and frequent comforting. In fact, he is quoted saying that infant crying is necessary because in the newly born infant, the crying expands the lungs. And so he is one of the first people who really starts to talk about or use the phrase cry it out. Although he is not the person who created the cry it out method, the sleep training method that we all know today, he is one of the first people to use the phrase cry it out. So in his 1892 infamous book called The Care and Feeding of Children, he says, quote, "The infant should simply be allowed to cry it out. This often requires an hour and, in extreme cases, 2 or 3 hours. A second struggle will seldom last more than 10 or 15 minutes, and a third will rarely be necessary." End quote. And like I said, he was a leading expert of his time. He published 3 books with dozens of new editions and 170 scholarly papers. He was a very trusted source of pediatric advice for both medical professionals and parents. And he held a lot of authoritative knowledge about lots of different pediatric topics. So he was extremely influential in decades of future parenting advice. And even though he is not the only person who really started talking about cry it out, but he is one of the first, not the first, but one of the first. And what we really found in our analysis was that a lot of fear-based messages were used to let the cry it out method, specifically the cry it out sleep training method, become really popular and acceptable in Western culture. And so the myth states that babies should cry it out to learn independence, and that is one of the claims of the cry it out method. But as I've talked earlier about, having a baby cry it out really does not do what it claims to do, what it claims the goal to be. Instead of teaching independence, it not only doesn't teach independence, but it can create attachment anxiety or feelings of attachment avoidance that a baby can potentially carry with them for years to come. The fourth myth is that attachment security and self-esteem are the same thing. I totally get how this can get a little confusing. They sound really similar, right? So a child who has attachment security or who has secure attachment loves themselves, loves other people, thinks highly of relationships, thinks the world is a good place to be. And so, yeah, it seems like that does describe a person who has high self-esteem. Attachment security and self-esteem are different but highly related concepts. So, self-esteem, you could argue that having high self-esteem is part of having secure attachment, right? Especially when we think about attachment as being opinions of ourselves, opinions of others, opinions of relationships, and opinions of the world around us. Part of that is our opinion of ourself, which our self-esteem is highly based on. So yes, they are very related concepts, but they are not the same thing. The fifth and final myth argues that babies who cry when left by a primary caregiver have an attachment problem. I cannot begin to tell you how many times I have heard, mostly women, complain about some aspect of this myth. So you are playing on the floor with your baby and you want to go get the dishes done. So you try to put some extra blocks in front of them and sneak off into the other room. But the second you are out of the baby's line of vision, your baby starts crying uncontrollably and you have to come back and calm them down and get them back to playing. And it seems like you can't leave for anything. You go to drop them off at daycare and they cry uncontrollably when you leave. You go to take them to grandma's house and they cry uncontrollably when you leave. And as a mom of 4 kids, this has happened to me so many times, and it is just as heart-wrenching the last time it happened as it was the first time it happened. It is very hard to leave a child who is crying, especially a baby, when, they can't communicate any other way. And so when you're leaving your 6-month-old or you're not even leaving, just handing your 6-month-old off to someone else, and you're still in the room, a lot of times they will cry about that. This is not uncommon. I am here to set the record straight. Whether your child cries or does not cry when you leave, it is not 100% indicative of their attachment to you. So, there are plenty of securely attached children who cry incessantly every time you leave. And there's plenty of securely attached kids who do not cry incessantly when you leave. There are also plenty of insecurely attached kids who cry incessantly when you leave, and there's plenty of insecurely attached kids who do not cry incessantly when you leave. So how would you know if you have secure attachment or not? I think the best way to explain this is to describe how researchers assess attachment in babies. Mary Ainsworth, who I talked about in episode 1, created an experiment that she called the strange situation. And this is how many, not all, but many researchers measure attachment in 9 to 18-month-olds. So let me give you a brief explanation of what it's like. It is actually quite strange. So they observe the behavior of the baby in a series of 8 episodes that last 3 minutes each. And it's meant to be odd. It's meant to be confusing to the baby. So there is a room with toys, and the mom and the baby and the experimenter go into the room. The experimenter gives the mom some instructions, play with the toys, sit on the floor with your baby and get them used to playing with the toys. And that lasts just like 1 minute, and the experimenter leaves. Then for 3 minutes, the mom and the baby are alone in the room with the toys. And the mom has been instructed to, play with the toys and get the baby interested in playing. Then a stranger joins the mother and the infant and just sits in the room, just sits there in a chair. Usually the baby notices the stranger, but the mother doesn't really interact with the stranger. That lasts for 3 minutes. The next episode is the mother leaves the baby and the stranger alone. So the mom leaves the room and the stranger stays in the room with the baby. 3 minutes. Then the mother returns and the stranger leaves. This is very weird, right? That happens for a few minutes. And the baby's still there. The baby's there the whole time. The 6th episode is the mother leaves and the infant is left completely alone. So all by him or herself. This is usually very jarring to the infant. They stay in the room by themselves for a few minutes. The researchers are not trying to overly upset the infant, so if the infant really breaks down, they're not going to leave the baby in the room by themselves for very long. But they might do it for, 2 or 3 minutes. Then the stranger returns, stays in the room for a few minutes. Then the mother returns and the stranger leaves. Okay, so that is definitely a strange situation. And I know what you're thinking. Okay, so how the hell does this tell me anything about how attached a child is? So it's really quite interesting how they score the strange situation. It's not about if the baby gets upset when the mother leaves. Most babies get upset when the mother leaves. All kinds of babies cry. Securely attached babies cry, insecurely attached babies cry when mom leaves the room. It's not about what happens when the baby is there with the stranger or when the baby is there by themselves. Instead, the researchers base their analysis on 4 interaction behaviors that are directed towards the mother in the 2 reunion episodes. So when the mother returns, there's 2 of those episodes in the 8 episode experiment. So the 4 interaction behaviors are proximity and contact seeking. Does the baby come to the mother and try to seek contact with the mother? The second one is contact maintaining. Does the baby want to stay touching the mother? Or do they just hug mom and then move away, right? So how long is the contact that the baby is trying to maintain, or how short it is? The third behavior is avoidance of proximity and contact. How much or how little does the baby avoid the mother? And the fourth one is resistance to contact and comforting. And so the observer, the researcher, will evaluate each one of these behaviors on a scale of 1 to 7. So 1 being very low intensity and 7 being very high intensity. They also look at other behaviors. So it's not just those 4 behaviors. Some other ones are things like Exploratory behaviors, which are things like moving around the room, playing with toys, looking around the room. Search behaviors, which are things like following the mother to the door, banging on the door, orienting towards the door, looking at the door, going to the mother's empty chair. And affect displays that are negative. So things like crying, or ones that are positive, things like smiling. And so they do look at those other behaviors when they are assessing the baby's attachment. And so just to give you a general description of what it could look like when a securely attached child is put in a strange situation experiment. A securely attached child tends to be distressed when the mother leaves. Then they tend to be avoidant of the stranger when they are alone. So when they're in the room with the stranger by themselves, they tend to avoid the stranger. But when the mother is in the room with the stranger, they tend to be friendly. They also tend to be positive and happy when the mom returns, and they use the mom as a safe base to explore their environment. Interestingly, close to 60 to 70% of infants are evaluated as securely attached. So that is good. It is much less common for an infant to have one of the insecure attachment foundations. And so what would some of the behaviors be if they had an insecure attachment? Well, there's a lot of them, but let's say that when the mother leaves, they could have intense distress, like unbelievably inconsolable distress, or absolutely no sign of distress when the mother leaves, like indifferent, like not caring at all. When the stranger is around, a insecurely attached infant would be okay with the stranger and plays normally when the stranger is present, is like totally fine with it. Or they could avoid the stranger and show fear towards the stranger even when the mother is in the room. When the mother returns, so this is like the big part where they really look at the behavior of the infant. The infant might approach the mother but resist contact or even push her away. Or the infant could just show little interest when the mother returns, like, oh yeah, hey, you're here. It's really not a big deal. An insecurely attached infant could be comforted by the stranger or the mother. The mother wouldn't be able to comfort any better than the stranger. The infant could also cry more when the mother returns and explore less. There's lots of different behaviors that researchers look at. And so to go back to the myth was babies cry when they are left, and this means that they have an attachment problem. I want to be very clear. It's not about your baby crying when you leave. Instead, it's about what happens on the return. When you return, or whenever your baby is crying, are you able to get them back to a homeostasis? Are you able to soothe them? Do they come to you for comfort when they are upset? And then are you able to downregulate their stress? So a securely attached child would cry when a parent leaves. And then when the parent comes back, they're able to let that parent calm them down and then get back to some level of calm normalcy. Now that I've debunked those 5 myths of attachment in early childhood, I'd like to give you some really clear tips on things you can do, things you can say, and things that you should avoid when you're trying to develop secure attachment in early childhood, which I'm going to define as birth to around 4 or 5 years of age. But before I get into those do's and don'ts, let's listen to a few moms I know. They're going to talk about how they calm their own children down during times of distress. Here's my friend Rachel, a mom of 3, ages 12, 7, and 4, talking about how she deals with toddler meltdowns, tantrums, crying spells, or just general toddler upset?
I let them feel it. I still, I still try to get on their eye level. I will get on my knees and I will sit across from them in the room and I'll let them feel what they have to feel, um, until they can get to a point where they're comfortable. And, if it's a situation where they'll let me actually physically hold them, I'll tell them, "I'm gonna hug you until you're okay." And I'll just hold them and they've cried into my shoulder or into my neck. Um, Even if they're angry and they want to lash out and if they say that I can hold them, I'll let them, fight against me until they can calm themselves. And I just talk to them calmly and I tell them that I'm there. I let them tell me when they're done feeling that first eruption of whether it's, you know, sadness or fear or anger, whatever it is, I let them tell me when they're done.
I love how Rachel says that she lets her children feel their feelings. I can't begin to express how incredibly important it is for adults to let children feel what they want to feel. How many times have you, as an adult, felt like what you were feeling was unwanted by the people around you? Or if you wondered if what you were feeling was the correct reaction to the experience you were having. It feels great for people of all ages to know that they are feeling something that someone else acknowledges and validates. Let me also say that I fully understand that it's difficult to be your child's calm every time they're upset, especially if you have multiple children. I live in a house with 4 children. If it isn't one of them, it's the other one. Sometimes my husband and I feel like we are in a revolving door of emotional support for our kids. And sometimes it can get really tiring for an adult to put in that much effort every single time a child is upset. But I also can't stress how important it is that you try. That you try every single time your child is upset. Pause. Take a minute to think about how they're feeling inside their body. And remember that letting them feel those feelings is really important in the attachment building process. Now let's listen to my friend Kristie. She's a mom of 2 little girls, ages 9 months and 4 years old. Here she's talking about her 4-year-old, Cecilia.
With Cecilia, it really is case by case. So the first thing is we kind of have to read her and understand, why she's upset. One tactic for us, depending on the situation, is just like embracing her can make a world of difference and calm her down. But at the same time, it could backfire. So sometimes she just needs space to kind of come around on her own to calm down. So sometimes it's giving her space, but letting her know that we love her. So providing unconditional love regardless of the situation. Or the other tactic is when she's upset, embracing her. And sometimes just giving her a hug will cause her lip to tremble and just let go of whatever she's upset about.
I love so much of what Kristie said, but I'd really like to focus in on the fact that Kristie has clearly become in tune with her daughter Cecilia, which is really important when you are trying to develop secure attachment. You have to spend a significant amount of time with your baby and your young child to figure out what it is that works best with them. And then, if you have more children, you need to recognize that what worked with one child might not work with another child. In my own personal experience, I vividly remember our son Gavin when he was an infant, he needed to be bounced, like strongly bounced, like I was doing lunges bouncing. So like a deep, long bounce, and that would calm him down. I don't know if it was just distracting him or, messing with his equilibrium. I don't know. Or he just likes roller coasters. I don't know what it was. But when I would do large dips, I guess is what you would call it, more than bouncing, that would always calm him down. And whenever I would try it with his twin sister, it didn't work. She did not enjoy that. If she was upset, she wanted to be swaddled really tightly, held very tightly as a young baby. And that would help calm her down. So not allowing any of her arms or legs to move. And so there was a lot of baby wearing with her. I would wrap her around my body in a baby wrap. Whereas with Gavin, he would not have ever been calmed by being tightly wrapped. And anyone who knows my son Gavin, that should make sense to you. But I love what Kristie says about how you have to read the situation with her daughter Cecilia and figure out if Cecilia needs to be hugged or if she needs some space. And it's okay if your child needs something in some situations and something else in other situations. It's your job as a parent who's trying to do that attachment work to figure it out, to become in tune and figure it out. Now let's listen to my friend April. She's a mom of 2, an 18-month-old boy and a 6-year-old girl. Here, she's talking about when her 6-year-old was a toddler.
She gets overwhelmed sometimes, and it happened a lot more in like toddlerhood, preschool, whatever. And she would just get frustrated and cry. The thing that worked the best with her is literally just holding her and just letting her cry. Sometimes you get frustrated because you have no idea what they're crying about, but all she ever really needed was a big hug. We would call it, "Do you need a snuggle?" And she would go, "Yeah." And that would work. You just held her and snuggled her for as long as she needed, and then she kind of picked back up where she was and went on playing again. That's all that worked for her.
Sometimes all any of us need is a hug, and research backs up this idea. Studies have shown that physical contact is one of the best ways to help babies, children, and even adults dissipate their stress. Some of you really understand the power of a hug. Some of you don't really care as much about physical contact, but for those of you who do, you know what it feels like to be stressed out, to be emotionally unstable, to receive physical contact, to receive a hug, and to feel your stress just melt away. So what are some things that you should do to help your baby develop a secure attachment foundation? Well, first of all, you need to understand that mental frameworks start to develop at birth. This is not something that you should wait to begin. So attachment work is not something that you should wait till a certain point in a child's life to start working on. You should be striving to create a secure attachment with your baby from day one. The second thing I think is really important to understand is that the primary attachment needs of babies and young children are physical contact and emotional connection. So babies need to be physically close to you as often as possible, and they need to feel emotionally connected to you. So attachments that are created in early childhood, and remember we're saying that this is birth to about 4 or 5 years, are based on reactions that children receive from primary caregivers during times of distress. And based on the consistency of these responses, children then develop those internal working models that can cause them to view themselves, other people, and the world in certain ways. So how do we get to that point? In the Attachment Matters digital workbook, I've dedicated a couple of pages in chapter 3 to answering this question. Specifically, I talk about what you should do, what you can say, and what you should avoid when you're trying to develop secure attachment in early childhood. And I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about some of these ideas. Let's start off with things that you can do. First, you need to respond. And I hope that that has been clear up to this point in this episode and the other 2 episodes, that you really need to respond to a baby or a young child when they are in distress. And in the digital workbook, I go as far as suggesting that you try to attend either verbally or physically to a child within 2 minutes. 2 minutes might seem like a short amount of time, but I don't know if you've ever been around a scream crying baby. 2 minutes is a really long time to not attend to a baby's cries for help. To listen to your baby cry for 2 solid minutes without attending to them, it is actually a long time. And so the reason that I even made the suggestion that long is because I recognize that sometimes you just can't get there, right? Sometimes you are attending to your older children and you just can't get away to attend to the baby, or you're in the shower and you have soap in your hair and you just can't get the soap out to get to your baby. In those instances, I think that it's important to remember that you can verbally attend to your baby that's in distress. So you might not be able to physically get to your child in the first 2 minutes, but you can at least verbally attend to your child. I'm coming, baby. I'm coming soon. Don't worry. Mama's coming. I'm on my way. I'll be there in a minute. I'm doing this. I mean, just talking to your baby out loud and them hearing your voice can help them dissipate some of their stress. Now, you're probably not going to hear them just stop crying when they hear your voice, but there is some stress dissipation happening. It might not be that visible to you, but it is happening. And one of the best examples that I have for this is if you have a baby who hates being in the car. Thank goodness, I only had one of these babies, and it was our youngest child, and he hated being in the car for, I would say, 9 or 10 months straight. Every single time we would get in the car, he would cry the entire time we were in the car. From the second he got put in his car seat till the second he got taken out of his car seat. Unless he was asleep in the car, he was crying in the car. I would frequently sit in the back with him if my husband was able to drive or if my mom was able to drive. And I would sit in the back with him, and that would help a lot if he was holding my hand and seeing my face and listening to me talk. But sometimes it didn't matter at all. He was still scream crying the whole time. Even if you can't physically touch your baby, so you're driving and you physically can't touch them, or even you're sitting in the back with them and you physically can't get them out, because yes, they would love to hold your hand and see you, but they really want you to hold them. They really want to get out of the car seat and be held by you. And so if you're unable to do that, the next best thing that you can do is try to soothe them by talking to them. And even though it might seem like outwardly they are just as upset as if you weren't saying anything to them, I can promise you that hearing your voice, listening to you talk in a calm, loving, sensitive way is helping them dissipate their stress. It might not be visible to you. They might still be screaming and crying, but it is helping them in some small way. So keep driving. If you feel the urge to pull over and get them out and give them a hug and then put them back and listen to them scream the rest of the car ride, go ahead and do that. But know that your voice is helping them to some degree. Another couple of suggestions that I have for things that you can do to develop a secure attachment in early childhood are first to comfort the child with physical touch by hugging, holding, carrying around, rubbing their back as often as possible. And two, to maintain close proximity whenever you are able. So, what does this mean? Whenever you are with your baby, you should be holding or carrying around or physically close to your baby as much as you possibly can. So if you need to go do the dishes, put your baby in a baby wrap, wrap the baby around your body and do the dishes, or put them in a bouncy seat next to the dishwasher so that they can see you while you're doing the dishes. If you need to go get some work done, bring them in the same room as you. Don't expect that your baby is going to feel okay with being away from you. They're not going to be okay with it. And this is a tough pill that lots of new parents have to learn to swallow. Babies want to be with you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They do not want to be alone. They do not want to be playing in their playpen with their toys by themselves. They would much rather be sitting on your lap, playing with a necklace that you have around your neck, and talking to you and babbling with you. They don't want to be by themselves. I get it. It's hard to juggle everything that you have to do while also giving a baby enough attention that they really, really need. But this is something that you should put into your expectations if and when you are planning to have children in the future, that they need as much physical contact and close proximity to you as you're willing to give them. So let's talk about some things that you could say when you are trying to develop secure attachment. Whenever your baby is upset, you should evaluate what's wrong by giving the baby words. I understand babies don't talk. I know this. But this is good practice for you to get used to for when they are able to talk. So I like to tell new parents that if you can start creating patterns of communication with your baby when they are pre-verbal, it's going to make it easier for you to continue those positive communication patterns when they actually start talking. And so evaluate what's wrong. Use words. You should be constantly talking to your baby, saying things like, are you hungry? Are you sad? Are you lonely? Saying these things to your baby will help you for when they can actually answer you later. So we're like laying the groundwork for your communication patterns to be the same when they can actually respond to you. You should also acknowledge and validate feelings. It's okay to feel sad. It's okay to feel lonely. Tell them that you would feel that way if you experienced what they're experiencing. I would be lonely too if I was in my playpen for more than a minute and a half, right? So you should be saying these things to acknowledge and validate the feelings of your baby and young child. A few things that you should always avoid when you're trying to develop secure attachment is, first of all, I've been very clear, but letting your child cry it out or ignoring your child when they're upset. These are things that you really need to avoid. And I'm not going to go over it again because I feel like I have ad nauseum, but you really need to avoid doing that. You should also avoid downplaying a child's feelings by saying something like, you shouldn't be so upset. This isn't a big deal. You're okay. Yeah, come on. Suck it up. I don't think that people usually say these things to babies, but they definitely say them to toddlers and preschoolers. So you should be eliminating that kind of minimizing from your vocabulary. The last thing that I think is really important for caregivers to avoid when they're trying to develop secure attachment in early childhood is to check their own emotions. If your child is upset, you should not match their upset with more upset of your own. You should be the calm for your child. And this is really important to keep in mind when you are making those communication choices with your babies and young children. So there's plenty of behaviors that foster security and plenty of behaviors that unfortunately result in insecurity. Some of these behaviors that foster security are things like assuring and hugging, comforting, encouraging, apologizing, validating, speaking calmly, and being happy. Some behaviors that create insecurity are things like diminishing, belittling, avoiding, scowling, criticizing, yelling, being inconsistent, acting disinterested. These are things that you should avoid when you are attempting to develop an early attachment foundation with your child. At the end of the day, children need to know that they are loved and lovable, which are two completely different yet equally needed feelings. Children need to know that they are loved by the people in their lives. You need to tell them and show them that you love them as often as you possibly can. But they also need to know that they're lovable. This is a very different feeling from feeling loved. Many people feel loved by at least one person in their life. Think about the people who love you. It's nice to feel loved by them. And most people have at least one person whom they feel loved by. It's that lovable part that's difficult for lots of people. Feeling lovable is the idea that if you met someone new, you know you're confident that they would like you. And if they don't like you, you're okay with it because you're a lovable person. This is where lots of children feel a void, and lots of adults too. You might feel loved by someone, but feeling loved and feeling lovable are different. I remember when our son Paxton was 4 years old. He was going to preschool for the very first time. He had never been in daycare before, and we were walking to his new school. It was close enough that we could walk. I was holding his hand, and I said, "Are you so excited to meet all these new friends?" And he said, "Yeah, I really am. I'm excited. School is going to be fun." I said, "What do you think is going to be the best part about school?" And he said to me, "Well, I think we're going to do lots of crafts and we're going to play outside. And my teachers, they're going to love me." And I just remember in that moment thinking, wow, he feels lovable. He feels like he could meet these teachers and they're just going to love him because of these internal working models that we've been developing within him for the last 4 years. I'm sad to say that as an 8-year-old, I don't know that he feels as lovable as he did when he was 4. There's something about going to school that I'll talk about in the next episode that kind of messes with all that great attachment work you did as a parent with your children in the first 5 years of life. It makes it a lot more difficult for you to continue to cultivate secure attachment in your children. But even though I can look at him as an 8-year-old and say, oh, he's probably struggling a little bit with that whole lovable part, I know the attachment foundation is strong, and I know that it's there. And it's going to be there with him for the rest of his life. We just need to work a little harder at building on top of that foundation. Thank you all so much for joining me for episode 3 of season 1 of the Love Matters podcast. If you're following along in the Attachment Matters digital workbook, this episode went over information from chapter 3. I hope you enjoyed the graphics and do's and don'ts included in that chapter. I'd like to give a special thanks to my mom contributors in this episode, Rachel, Kristie, and April. Again, I am your host, Dr. Jenny Rosier, and as always, you can find me on Instagram at Relationships, Love, Happiness, on Facebook and YouTube by searching for the Relationships, Love, Happiness Project, and on the web at www.relationshipslovehappiness.com. I hope you'll join me for episode 4, where I plan to talk about attachment in middle childhood and adolescence. Thanks for listening.